I am Zara Armour, and this is The Change, a podcast featuring stories about women, technology, and the Anthropocene. This project is an experiment, one that seeks to draw in an ever-growing climate-conscientious public by starting and sustaining a mature, informed, and thoughtful conversation about the reality of climate breakdown while identifying the most impactful and scalable technologies that stand to considerably help the environment. The podcast is hosted by my friend, Antoinette Waltzamakis. Antoinette and I have received tremendous support from our partners and distributors, which we are very grateful for, and we are very excited to be bringing these stories to a broad audience. All views expressed are those of the person speaking and not their employer.
Our guest today is Theanne Schiros. She's a PhD and associate professor at the Fashion Institute of Technology, a research scientist at Columbia University, and a co-founder and the chief science officer of Werewool, a biotech company creating biodegradable textile fibers with DNA-programmed color and performance. Her research focuses on development and characterization of advanced materials for climate action, including clean energy technology and regenerative performance textiles for a circular economy. Theanne's research has received international recognition, including the 2020 H&M Foundation Global Change Award for Werewool, the 2018 Postcode Lottery Green Challenge, and in 2017 the National Geographic Chasing Genius Award Sustainable Planet for Algiknit. Dr. Schiros has served as a United Nations ECOWAS Centre for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Fellow, a New York State Energy Research and Development Authority Fellow, and an Energy Frontier Research Center Fellow researching organic photovoltaics, photocatalysts, and sustainable energy systems. In this week's interview, we will speak to Theanne about the Anthropocene, her research, the startups she co-founded, and microbial leather. And now, I give you Theanne.
Hi, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, especially just a couple days before COP26 begins.
So, Theanne, did you want to start with saying anything to us about your definition of transformative adaptation?
Yeah, I'd love to. It's something I think a lot about, and right now we're largely confronted with that. If we think about the Anthropocene, which is the proposed geologic epoch we're currently living in, which is defined by humans, one species, being the primary drivers of planetary systems. And the set of tipping points that's created, it's really timely to think about transformative adaptation, because in the next 10 years, what we do will determine the next 10,000. It will largely determine our fate on the planet, the fate of the planet, what the fossil record looks like. And so it's really, it sort of feel like 10 years is a long time, but in the next 10 years and now 8 years, we are confronted with needing to reduce our global climate emissions by 50%. That is a really, really daunting task, but we are now in the midst of a global climate crisis. And the issue with that is part of a whole web of ecological tipping points. We have a set of planetary boundaries. Climate is one of them, that are really closely related to social justice and ethics, that the world kind of is held between. And as one boundary is transgressed, there's a whole cascade effect. So we're finding ourselves more than ever that what we do in any one area can have a tipping cascade in many different trajectories. So transformative adaptation, we're at a time where how are we going to tip this in the way that is a safe operating system for humanity? And I think that begs the question, can technology save life on Earth? And this is something I think we'll talk about in general, but my answer to is, can technology save life on Earth, is only in partnership with biodiversity, and only in recognition of the profound interconnections between climate and social systems, and the opportunities those connections present for climate solutions. So humans right now are confronted with the adaptation. We either need to preserve nature or master its tricks. one way or the other, to maintain a stable operating for us to continue us on this earth. And so that people are learning to undertake nature's tasks. So creating artificial glaciers to irrigate their crops, building artificial coral reefs, artificial photosynthesis, something I worked in many years ago for solar fuels, using sunlight to make fuels to store energy in chemical fuels. Then there's other efforts like rewilding efforts, which is sort of letting nature balance itself back out. But that's also greatly assisted by technology like machine learning. And I think one of the biggest things that we're starting to realize is that advanced technology for transformative adaptation has to be balanced by room for biodiversity and understanding that some of the biggest opportunities to adapt and transform are available. For instance, education of women and girls is ranked as one of the largest climate mitigation strategies in the next between 2020 and 2050. That has the potential to sequester almost 86 gigatons of CO2. That and food waste are the biggest options we have for lowering our carbon emissions. So this was put out by Drawdown. So we really have to think about how can we use technology in collaboration with leaving room for biodiversity to adapt. And what we do will really determine the fate of our planet.
When you put it like that, it feels like a big responsibility. So I want to just explore a little bit more about what you see in terms of the Anthropocene. So on your call with Zara, you discussed the significance of looking at and framing the work that you do through the lens of the Anthropocene. How do you define the Anthropocene, its significance and its implications with regard to global environmental change?
So the Anthropocene was a term first suggested by Paul Crutzen in 2000. And it's the idea that if you look at what defines a geologic epoch, mass extinctions, the type of species, the temperature of the planet, the atmosphere of the planet, we are no longer in the period that we thought we were in, which is the Holocene. And the Holocene has been the last 11,000 years where human civilization has basically agriculture started, the whole written record started, because it was enabled by this like Goldilocks period of not too hot, not too cold, really stable, equitable climate, balanced levels of CO2, a little bit higher than before, so agriculture could flourish, plants could flourish. It was the beginning, the shift from hunter-gatherer societies to communities and written records, because agriculture now kept people in one place. But when we look at that trajectory, so we were on course to stay in the Holocene for another 30, 40 years. By the strange quirk of the tilt of the earth, we were in this really equitable period. And then something changed. And that something that changed was the vast, absolute explosion of the human enterprise, starting with pulling fossil fuels out of the earth in 1750. But what's even more pronounced is that as we got into the 1950s, all the new materials humans started making, mining, plastics, aluminum in its elemental form was not even known before the 19th century. It's bauxite in the earth. So all the things that humans started developing have actually changed the planet. It's the characteristics of the Holocene are no longer there. The climate is different. The acidification of the oceans is different. The amount of reactive nitrogen is different. And so this puts us in a position to really think about we may be in a new proposed geologic epoch where humans really are driving planetary systems and, ironically, our ability to survive in those systems without really kind of right in front of our very eyes. And so we see, and these are the reason this is proposed as a new geologic epoch is because the marks of the Anthropocene, the marks of human impact will remain in the fossil record. So whether we're here or not here, right, this tipping point we talked about, whether humans survived the world they made, the planet they made or not, it depends on our course of action. But there's 7 marks of the Anthropocene that will live in a geologic record. And this comes from detonation of nuclear weapons starting, the 1940s, 1952. So we see different isotopes of carbon and plutonium. Fossil fuels, it changes not only the amount of CO2 in the air, but stored in the ice cores. It puts carbon particles locked into different sediments. New materials. We've made 208 new minerals. we have not made by mining and e-waste, and e-waste gets dumped and weathered, and all these exotic phosphors in TVs and screens make exotic new compounds. We have 208 new minerals. We haven't seen an explosion like that for 2.5 billion years since the Great Oxidation. So global warming, mass extinctions. So now what does that look like? So this is the basis of the Anthropocene, that we are the planetary record in the last 150, but really 50 years, because of human impacts, is enough to signify a new geologic epoch. And the new geologic epochs are largely defined by, the kinds of things that can live, the kind of life on the planet. And so that brings us to our definition of kind of what the Anthropocene is. And then following that, there's a set of planetary boundaries that create a safe operating system for humanity. Climate is one of them. Climate and biodiversity are core planetary boundaries, but there's others, and they're all intimately connected. There's acidification, biodiversity, climate, amounts of reactive nitrogen, chemical pollution, fresh water access, right? These define an operating system for humanity. We are now in the midst of a complete global climate crisis. We have not seen carbon dioxide levels this high or temperatures this high in all of the Holocene. And it's basically, at this point, going up and up. And because of the interconnectedness of these boundaries, it's like a runaway train. So you start having carbon dioxide, it acidifies the ocean, it changes habitats. So you have huge biodiversity loss. Biodiversity is our greatest resilience for a stable climate, because that diversity gives us resilience. So we're really at this point where and what's really connected to our very linear take, make, waste production models of energy and materials have gotten us to this point where we're creating a world that we're like at the edge of a cliff, or, which way are we going to go? We're at this precipice, and it's a tipping point. So is it going to be, where's the there's all these feedback loops, and we're at the edge of a number of feedback loops, and which way are we going to push them? So it's a very daunting time, but it's also, we actually know how to reduce climate emissions. We know how to live within these planetary boundaries. So the challenge for humanity is if we're going to do it in time. And that becomes a fascinating question of cultural shifts, and kind of letting people know that, we need systems change and we need individual change. And I think it makes it a very daunting and very exciting time to be alive.
Yeah. What I'm hearing you say is that each of these things individually are pretty significant in their impact, but taken together, they have an amplifying effect on one another.
Exactly. That's the uncertainty that makes us in a new kind of geologic epoch, because it's in such stark contrast to the stability of the Holocene with this equitable climate. The average global temperature, is about 60 Fahrenheit. I mean, that's lovely, right? That's a really nice place for humanity to grow food and thrive. So what happens when we push that? And in connecting to some of the research and how technology, how we got into this and how we can get out of it. I mean, if humans can warm the planet, humans can cool the planet, right? So there's this huge responsibility, but we know the systems of production that have pushed to this point, and we know the systemic injustices that have got us to this point, and we know how to correct them. So the linear production model, which is, largely the global north producing materials in the global south with no regard for safe chemicals, safe working conditions, fair, equitable compensation, and then taking those materials, using them, or sometimes not using them. Many of the materials that are produced with a huge environmental expense and human health expense never get used. They simply get disposed of, again, in the global south, where this is something else to manage. And this is where it's a huge issue, because addressing these issues. So the linear economy is fundamentally rooted in colonialism, because it assumes access. It assumes land access. It assumes water access. If you stop assuming access, and you have to be accountable for where things start and where things end, now you have the basis of a circular economy, which is where you emulate nature's cycling of matter and energy, and we can tip this in the right direction. So as complicated as it is, there's some guiding tenets that are fairly straightforward.
Right. So is that what you were talking about when you spoke with Zara on the first call? You mentioned that focusing on the Anthropocene is a powerful way for you to teach, and that it affords a lot of opportunities. What are the opportunities you mean?
As we've kind of discussed, you hear about new materials and climate and biodiversity and social human justice, and it's a lot, right? It's a lot for the brain to take in. And then how sometimes that works out to be is you walk to the store and you try to buy broccoli and you can't buy anything because one's not organic, but the one that's organic is in styrofoam, and you sort of don't have any guiding principles. So what the Anthropocene allows us to do is think about at systems level human impact and the impact of our global industrialization, and look at it in kind of big picture guiding principles. So at every stage of production, if it's linear and you don't have recycling, you're not responsible for the emissions, any linear model is going to end in an imbalance that is detrimental to human and planetary health. So what it gives us the opportunity is to think of systems. And therefore, it's not about the broccoli or the plastic, or is it a bamboo shirt or an organic cotton shirt? It's about systems thinking, where it came from, how it was made, and along the way. So the Anthropocene allows us to think about the impacts of the linear economy, basically extraction and disposal and toxicity along the way. And so then it sort of takes you out of this very specific topic, and you can apply those principles to all sorts of things. And I think the guiding principles for the Anthropocene is making, as a teaching model, is how do we make global industrialization compatible with nature and compatible with sustainable development? And the beautiful thing about that is over, 4 billion years, nature has given us these blueprints for complete recycling of matter and energy in a way where at the end of a useful process or life, a material re-enters the ecosystem to provide nutrients for the next process. And it gives us a way to map that nature's genius onto human design and human enterprise.
So how does all of this tie into the course that you teach on the Anthropocene, planetary boundaries and climate stability at Columbia University?
So that's at the Fashion Institute of Technology. And the name of that course is it's a course that I wrote, and it's called The True Cost, Product Life Cycle and the Science of Sustainability, where we take these big concepts of human impact and we use an approach called life cycle impact assessment to model extraction of raw materials to manufacture end of life of two objects. It can be a PLA container and a styrofoam container, and show which is the better environmental performance, where are the biggest hotspots, and how the biggest impacts are the biggest opportunities. And in a simple educational way and teaching way, I think that's where we look at. When we identify the impacts of human behavior and the biggest impacts in something tangible, like a polyester shirt compared to a cotton shirt, or types of packaging, you see the opportunities. So the impacts are opportunities. And we have a plethora of technologies and recycling strategies that can be applied. And so it allows students and young people who are also, to think about waste-led design. So these are the makers, these are the consumers, this is the generation that's going to be left with what we've handed them with the last 50 years. And so it kind of allows it to distill down to what the impacts are and then see those interconnections.
And I really like what you're saying, because in a way you're saying begin with the end in mind. Instead of designing for immediate consumption, design from the point of view of where is the end point of this, and then design it backwards, kind of reverse engineering it in a way.
That's true because of the way we think of things, reverse engineering, but that's because it's reversing a linear thinking. I actually have more of the thinking that it doesn't matter where you start, because if it's a closed loop, it's a circle. So you'll wind up back where you began. So you can start with a t-shirt that exists and drive it back to compost or turn it into something else. So in this circular thinking, which is a circular economy, seeks to emulate nature's cycling using ecologically benign processes to close and minimize material energy loops. And the idea is that the main premise is that infinitely using our materials can make industrialization compatible with nature and human health. And in nature, let me take you the example. I'm looking at my garden. I see, a kale plant. At what stage is that kale plant? Well, it was a seed. And before that, and that seed sprouted from the nutrients in the soil, which came from the last batch of kale that I didn't finish. And so you kind of look at something as a snapshot in a circular feedback between other ecological systems and materials. And I think if we can look at our industrial materials in that same way, where did it come from and where is it going? And this is just one snapshot in a life of reintegration and reuse. It gives us a lot of opportunities to really not only minimize our impacts, but advance society.
Yeah. So I get it. It's not so much the birth and death way of looking at things. It's much more organic in that sense. And as you said, taking from the way nature is part of a constant cycle, and everything was something else in a previous incarnation of itself. So let's talk about the Anthropocene. And earlier you talked about tipping points. So if we were to bulk the tipping points into what are arguably two of the most critical categories, the Amazon rainforest and the West Antarctic ice sheet, for the sake of simplification, so you don't have to speak individually to all of them, could you talk a little bit to us about how the fashion industry has contributed to their decline? So talking about the Amazon rainforest, the West Antarctic ice sheet, how has the fashion industry contributed to the decline of those two?
Again, this is the idea where the biggest impacts are the biggest opportunities. What is not commonly known is that the fashion industry is one of the most environmentally impactful industries in the world. It is responsible for 10% of global carbon emissions. It's responsible for up to 20% of global wastewater and 35% of microplastic pollution. So the climate, the carbon and water impacts and toxicity of the fashion industry is huge. So the Amazon rainforest, I think that the biggest deforestation in the Amazon is livestock and also oils. It's not so directly for textiles, for instance, but it's all really interconnected because it's a huge global industry, and it's being it's the reason the fashion industry is so polluting. It is that it is intimately linked to agricultural and petrochemical industries. But what we can see is that the Antarctic ice sheets, that climate change, it melts the ice sheets. Now, the big thing about melting ice sheets and permafrost is this tipping point. It's the feedback loop. The ice sheets and the Amazon represent. So the idea of how the fashion industry affects those two biomes or ecosystems is in its large scale pollution, water, and climate effects, right? They're all interconnected. But what that looks like is that the reason the fashion industry, because it has such an impact, what you see is that when the ice sheets melt and the currents start changing and the permafrost melts, as the more the ice sheets melt, the less those ice sheets and permafrost can reflect heat from the sun. And so now you're at this tipping point where instead of reflecting the light back, now all of a sudden you have this cascade where you can't reflect it back, and it's absorbing more and more heat. And what the big danger of that is that all of a sudden, if our carbon stores, like the forest, like the rainforest and the ice sheets, stop sequestering carbon dioxide and start emitting carbon dioxide, now you're compounding human activity that's causing these things to no longer sequester carbon with this huge floodgate of carbon by releasing the carbon stores from the permafrost and having the rainforest. The Amazon rainforest is at a tipping point where it is about to no longer be able to be a carbon sink and start to become a carbon source because of deforestation. And that's the same with the permafrost and the ice sheets. It's not. So what happens with the fashion industry largely, and any of these large polluting industries, is that we're pushing on the planetary boundaries so that the Earth systems, which is like a resilient friend to us, it kind of buffers our activity because biodiversity, ice sheets, rainforest, all of this gives us this resilience to to operate and kind of be buffered from it. And then it switches quickly and it starts amplifying our activity. And we will not be able to respond in time. We're barely able to respond to lowering our carbon emissions from our activity. If the Earth flips it against that drive, that's where it becomes really daunting time. So any kind of impact reduction you can do in the textile, petrochemical, agricultural industries are huge because it puts us to the tipping back where the Earth stays our friend and offers us enhanced resilience for industrialization.
Yeah. So could you be a little bit more specific? You've said any change we can make to the global industrial fashion industry. What specifically should we be looking for from the fashion industry that helps us keep the tipping point on the right side of tipping?
Yeah. So in any industry, but the fashion industry in particular, there is a movement, and the simple answer is circularity. And I can give you a couple examples of what that looks like. So the lowest, every material, I work in new materials, right? So we are trying to engineer materials that cut out industrial processes and follow nature strategies. And we can talk a little bit about how that can happen. So we look to harness, we take inspiration from nature's vast regenerative potential and use low energy consuming organisms like microbes, and we program them to make color and have stretch like nature does, which is DNA programmed proteins. And we're coming up with all these kind of ways where we take inspiration from nature and we map it into human design and industrialization. That's one avenue, and that's really exciting and promising. The danger with that is that, as you mentioned, this seems like a lot of responsibility, and humans want a silver bullet. They're like, oh, well, you're making, stretchy hot pink polyester without dyes and plastics, so we're going to be fine. No, that's not enough. That's an area where it's wonderful because innovation and sustainability becomes joyful and a place of discovery and excitement, right? So that kind of excites the human potential and imagination. And we start to think of sustainability as an opportunity for innovation rather than something you can't have. And by the same token, so the other side of that is really straightforward strategies, simply keeping things in the economy longer. So, I mean, upcycling. So there's the idea of, engineering new materials, taking inspiration from nature through synthetic biology. But there's also the idea that, waste to resource strategies, which sound new, but nature, there's no waste in nature. So it's just everything is a resource. And if we start mapping that, cellulosic agricultural waste alone could meet 2.5 times the whole global textile fiber demand in waste products. So finding ways to pull fibers from cellulose fibers instead of cotton, which is really extremely water intensive. The Aral Sea used to be one of the four largest lakes in the world. It's all but barren because of irrigation projects diverting water to China and Asia for cotton, largely for cotton production. Cotton has huge environmental impacts. It has carbon footprint, water footprint, pesticides, fertilizers. But there's enough cellulosic waste to meet 2.5 times over the global fiber demand. So thinking about ways to take agro-industrial waste and pull fibers that instead of it's moving away from this extraction mentality. So that can come with every liter of water and kilometer of land that's not used for clothes can be used to meet basic human needs. So I think that there's a twofold strategy. Both are circular, right? Because it's like you're using rapidly renewable organisms to create biodegradable materials, and the other is just taking what's already existing. The best when people say, "What material are you the most excited about?" It's like part of it is the one that already exists and is reintegrated in a environmentally benign way into the system.
Yeah. So that really leads very nicely on to the next point. And according to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, clothing production globally roughly doubled between 2000 and 2015. And during that same period, the number of times a garment was worn declined by 36%. The idea of fast fashion, and I guess Twitter and Instagram and those types of social media imperatives are driving some of this, the kind of consumer behavior. And over roughly the same period, according to the World Economic Forum, 60% more garments were purchased, but consumers only kept them for half as long. So I guess that part of what you're saying, and feeds into what you were talking about, is that one of the big environmental problems with the fashion industry is that it's the volume of unwanted clothing that winds up in landfills.
Yeah, landfills or markets in the global south without, without asking, without access or permission. So again, it's rooted in this linear economy and overconsumption. So if you have to be responsible for where things go, did you ever do the clothing clear out and, you're like, where should I bring this? Where should I bring these piles of clothes? Once you start thinking about things in a circular way, if you're responsible for where they end up, and there is no quote away, right? With the Slow Factory Foundation, I took my students to, they have an initiative called Landfills as Museums. And we went to one of the largest landfills in the United States, and they just walked on piles of trash and flip-flops and clothes. And globally, a truckload of textiles reaches a landfill every second. So part of these cultural shifts is making those connections, because then it motivates behavioral change. It motivates creating ecosystems. And I mean sort of commercialization, like entrepreneurial ecosystems where new technologies, like some of the ones we're doing in the fashion space, are accelerated. So, this is a case where the solutions are there. There's many of them. And, there's not going to be one answer. So there will always be a drive for performance materials. So engineering performance materials that emulate nature and are biodegradable and can replace toxic dyes and plastics. There's going to be a need for that. But there's parts to it. And so once you identify these things, then you can start creating the solutions, which is going to require transdisciplinary collaboration throughout the supply chain. And so, so people who are really built into the system and they see the value add, and it's not going to be, these complex global solutions and complex supply chains need these sort of really collaborative solutions. And to my mind, that's also a way we have to start thinking, because in nature, there's no rigid hierarchies. So there's no top-down boss, right? And to create solutions, that's something we have to start mapping into our enterprise, that we have diverse voices from scientists and engineers and policymakers, as well as corporations and brands, that are ensuring these things get accelerated to market with the appropriate certifications. So life cycle assessment, the Higgs index, all these kind of certifications of what I think is that people are afraid, to some degree, is that people are afraid. Everyone wants that silver bullet sustainable material. So it keeps people, it oppresses, the ability to show, here's the true impacts of this. Here's the impact reduction. Here's the impact for opportunity. We could do better here. Let's partner. But what that happens is you expose yourself for it not being a wonder material. And that's really, really problematic, because it really limits progress. Where if you said, hey, I was able to reduce the toxicity and carbon footprint, but we still use a lot of water. Can we partner up to address this next aspect where everyone's a stakeholder? It would really improve things. So certifications help there.
So moving progressively rather than seeking perfection.
So back to transformative adaptation, I think for us to tip the planetary systems, which is a crazy thing to say, that, in the 4 billion years of Earth, and humans have been around 200,000, and then the last 50 years of 4 billion, we're at a tipping point driving our planetary system. But in order to drive it the right direction, that kind of aside, to drive it the right way, it's going to be collaboration over competition. And so this is back to survival of the fittest. Darwin never meant the strongest one species survives. It was the most resilient. It was the most adaptive. So when Darwin said survival of the fittest, it was a species that was able to adapt to changing circumstances. And those are the ones that have survived all the mass extinctions. So our ability to adapt will really determine whether we're a species that survives the next mass extinction we're kind of threatening with our own activity.
Does climate change cause more intense hurricanes? Why is Tyson Foods so bad for workers and the environment? How can vaccine distribution prioritize the Black and Latinx people who've been most vulnerable to COVID-19? Will pickup truck drivers go for an electric Ford F-150? Fans of this podcast might also enjoy Got Science from the Union of Concerned Scientists, featuring guest experts who answer a range of science-related big questions. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
You've said a lot of things so far around the circular economy, learning from nature, building awareness, knowing what's in the landfill, this very linear approach that we have, the extent to which we export almost the extraction of our value into the global south with little thought of the consequence for where it ends up. We get it cheap and at high environmental cost from the global south, and we send it back there to sit in landfill. To what extent is technology in a position to clean up the supply chain? We've talked around political will and policy and certification and cooperation, but I'm just wondering where we're at in technology. Are we saying actually we have enough technology to really make an impact on the supply chain, but something else is holding us back, or the technology is not quite there yet and we need to do something to get it there? Where are we in that?
Both. So there's solutions that are ready to go, and there's solutions that need time. So a big dichotomy is that we have the urgency for climate action, and then the longer developmental time frame for deep tech. So especially biotech solutions to enter the market at cost and at scale. But those can both be accelerated. So we can talk about some of the different opportunities. I mean, the waste to resource strategies are there. There's a lot of strategies. I mean, we can focus on, for instance, let's pull out of fashion and just talk to big impacts. Education of women and girls, one of the biggest climate mitigation strategies you can do. That's there. So it was 85 gigatons of carbon sequestered, right? And between 2020 and 2050. And sometimes the technology there completely exists. So it's not always building a school. It's actually building a well so that the girls can go to school because they're not spending 5 hours a day walking, carrying tons of water. And if they make it to school at all, they're too exhausted to stay awake and study. So there's very simple technology that can support the climate solutions that have huge impacts that would get us back to a place of stability so that some of these the deeper technology that would pave a way for like a really symbiotic future with globalization compatible with nature can develop. Second one is food waste, right? So food waste, it's actually the number one climate mitigation strategy is reducing food waste. Food, back to the circularity, it can not only be nutrients for the soil for regenerative agriculture, which is critically important because healthy soil can hold 3 times as much carbon as the atmosphere. So we can think about food waste, and these strategies are there. Another example is anaerobic digesters, where either at a local scale, you break down your food waste, you have gas that powers your grill, your house, your heat, you're not pulling. So, the idea that you would throw away waste, food, pay for it to go to landfill, and then buy gas will be absurd. Now, if we can shift to a little bit more of some of the kind of inspiring future work, where we can think about programming microorganisms to create performance materials with bottom-up assembly and strategies that are really compatible with nature for a whole new generation of materials. And this is where biofabrication can offer some really exciting solutions. It's been called the fourth industrial revolution. So there's that. So, but I always think that it's very important to balance some of these really maybe more sexy future technologies with the fact that we have the knowledge and the technology in place today to dramatically reduce our carbon emissions. That's there, and that should be carried out. There's another side of it where there'll be always a drive for new materials and advanced materials. Materials can't just be more sustainable; they have to do something more. And this is where biofabrication comes in.
And that actually leads us beautifully to the next point that I wanted to discuss about where the new technology, is doing things that are sexy and exciting. And I know our listeners will want to hear more about that and the kinds of projects you're working on. So we know that new fibers and materials that rely on products that are found in nature are being facilitated by technology. Several companies are developing alternatives to leather because hides are particularly problematic. And of course, this is something that you're working on, and we'd really love to have a bit of a conversation more specific to the research and the original work that you're doing with your startup. So I'm thinking in particular of what you are doing with Algiknit and Werewool, where you're developing an algae-based yarn and wool fiber alternative. Would you tell us a little bit more about those projects?
Sure, I'd love to. I think that what these projects, Algiknit is based on kind of a bioutilization of a rapidly renewable biopolymer from kelp, which kind of has the potential. Kelp is it's really quick growing. It pulls in nitrogen from that would otherwise lead to eutrophication in dead zones. But I think another area which is more on the biomimicry side is actually focusing on not extracting biopolymers directly from nature unless it's from agro-industrial waste streams, and using organisms to produce materials, microorganisms. So you can think of microbes as the future fiber factories. And it turns out that microbes are really interesting building blocks because they can brew materials. So one thing that Werewool is really inspired by is the fact that in nature, proteins are not just building blocks.
Theanne, just before we jump back into it, because I'm dying to ask this and it's not in the interview schedule, but how on earth did you get interested the biological properties of things and making them into new materials? Where did that come from?
So it may be funny that a physicist, right, someone with a PhD in physics who was working on, catalysts and electronics moved into this space. But it is, so when I first started, something that maybe is surprising is before I did a PhD in physics, I did an undergraduate in liberal arts with a focus on art history and American studies. We're really studying like the effects of capitalism and advertising. And I was working at an art gallery in New York, just a few blocks from FIT when I was in my early 20s. And I was always really interested in the environment. And so I wanted to go pursue a higher degree in renewable energy technology for climate. And so that brought me to a PhD at the Linear Accelerator at Stanford University, studying atomistic relationships for catalysts and how we could convert sunlight to fuels through solar water splitting, artificial photosynthesis, and then use those fuels like hydrogen in fuel cells. So this was about following nature's cycling of energy and renewable energy. And then as I went on, I worked more on solar cells, and that was my original love. And then I took a faculty position at FIT. There was a call for future faculty in science and sustainability. And when I got to FIT, I realized the huge impacts of the fashion industry in a way I had really not thought about, because I was really thinking about energy impacts all the time and global carbon budget. And so it was kind of twofold. I switched or transitioned. I'm still working on electronic materials, but from renewable energy systems to regenerative material systems. And what I also realized was this not only was a huge area for impact reduction, and we quantify it through that life cycle assessment. So we could look at the carbon reduction of new materials and the water reduction, but it was a wonderful teaching tool. It was a conduit for non-traditional scientists and non-science students to participate in a way. And in fact, both Algiknit and Werewool startups are with students, former FIT students that have non-science backgrounds, and they're launching kind of material science companies. So I think that educational aspect of making solutions accessible through fashion. I mean, fashion creates culture, culture creates change. So fashion is a really interesting way to, it's a great messenger, capsule for the messenger. So we made a pair of bio leather sneakers with microbes. And, if I had showed you a piece of microbial leather or talked about the process, it maybe doesn't capture the imagination. But you see these trainers that we made in collaboration with a fashion design award winners, public school New York, and they're these sneakers. And now that's the story lives in those sneakers. They're kind of a living message. So I think that has become a really great way for me to reach people, and sort of this cultural change, kind of be engaged in the educational aspects that need to happen to lower our environmental impact and carbon footprint.
What a journey. What an amazing journey. You're definitely a polymath, that's for sure. You're very talented in a wide range of topics. I'm going to pull us back just to make sure that we do capture, just in case some of that didn't work, because I think what you were talking about on the new materials and the way it works is really fascinating. So I'm sorry to ask you to say it again, but I do think it will be so powerful. Just if we just back up then and go back to the creation of the new fibers and materials, and how those rely on products that are found in nature, driven by technology, and talking about the companies, the startups that you've been working on, and the research you've been doing with Algiknit and Werewool, developing algae-based yarn and wool fiber. Could you tell us a little bit more about those projects, and in particular those materials, and what's so fascinating about them, and how you came up with the idea of developing them?
So I think biofabrication, we talked about as the fourth industrial revolution, with a lot of potential to make industrialization compatible with nature. Biofabrication is takes inspiration from living systems in a bottom-up assembly of materials, the way nature does, that ultimately can be broken down by biological processes. And so central to the work that I've been doing is using microbes to build up materials, green chemistry to process them that are not toxic to those living cells, and then another class of microbes that can break those materials down so that they can re-enter the ecosystem as nutrients for healthy soil and the next generation of materials. And the climate change mitigation potential of biofabrication processes and biomaterials is estimated at up to 2.5 billion tons of carbon equivalent per year by 2030. So this is another strategy to lowering that carbon footprint. And then greater offsets can be achieved if that bioengineering is used to displace conventional textiles, which are on track. The fashion industry is on track to take up a quarter of the global carbon budget by 2050. So that's an exciting area. And one of the things that we look at, again, going back to where are the biggest impacts, there are the biggest opportunities. So all the performance properties we want in our clothing, vivid color, stretch, moisture management, thermal regulation, these all currently come at a really high environmental and human health cost because they're based on petrochemicals and synthetic materials that introduce toxicity and compromise biodegradability. But nature has all these properties and more without the environmental impact. And the way nature has done that, it's part of the resilience, is that it adapts its genetic sequence to encode for proteins to have a certain function. So coral and so the red discosoma coral, which was our first prototype, inspired our first prototype for Werewool, has this beautiful red color, and it's evolved for a symbiotic relationship with the zooxanthellae algae. It gives them UV protection, and that's not dye or pigment. That is a microscopic protein structure. It's a beta barrel. A small tweak to that structure on the barrel gives you the green fluorescent protein, which is how other marine organisms communicate. Hornets and wasps have evolved a DNA sequence to encode for a protein that makes their nest waterproof. And so, this idea that, in the face of losing half the coral reef in the Great Barrier Reef, at a time when we can just learn from it, right? What can we ask nature, and how can we learn from these organisms? So Werewool is really rooted in asking nature, how do you achieve this desired function? And then we take the original biological sequence for the protein, and we engineer it in the lab. And how we do that is we use microbes as the raw material factory. And we use microbes, yeast and bacteria, to brew these proteins. And we do that by inserting the DNA sequence that codes for the protein into the organism. And then every time it multiplies, it brews it. So it's, the fermentation process. Microbial fermentation is the basis of wine and beer. It's an ancient process. But now we're taking this ancient process and using it to make materials. Now those proteins come out, and now they need to become a fiber. So it's a liquid of proteins. It's a test tube of beautiful colored proteins, or proteins that can stretch, but they're not doing that. They're in a test tube in the lab or a beaker. And so what we do there is we actually engineer onto the protein certain binding sites, so chemically sticky sites, so that we can follow nature's strategy for assembly. So if you engineer certain binding sites, those proteins will find each other and link with themselves and other materials into a biomaterial, a functional biomaterial. We also engineer binding sites to let us use nature's catalyst, enzymes, to cross-link things. So this is without the toxic plasticizers, the harsh solvent-based chemistry, to link things into a biomaterial. And what that enables us to do is use these really eco-friendly coagulation and cross-linking baths to make our fibers, because they have to be compatible with a protein, which is, a biological protein has, you can't use harsh toxic things. You would kill the protein and kill the function. So to immobilize it into a fiber, by following nature strategies, not only for performance and color, which is conferred through this microscopic protein, which if you think about it, it's so cool. It's like a little it's microscopic biomimicry. You're taking a structure and imparting a function. But by adding these groups to link it together, we're really also following nature's strategies for assembly. So we're not extracting, finite natural resources, but we're not using toxic processing parameters. And so this way you can create really high performance materials in a green chemistry framework. At the end of the life, they're biodegradable. The added benefit of this is that we have demonstrated that so microbial fermentation there's many companies doing this, and it's really exciting. So Modern Meadow brews collagen for animal-free leather. Spiber makes protein, a spider silk protein. Bolt Threads is working on spider silk protein. But what we have been able to actually do is leverage some of the principles we talked about and add binding sites so that our designer proteins, which are kind of expensive to produce because they're usually produced for really high value products, can be linked to biopolymers from waste streams, plant-based biopolymers. So now the bulk of our fiber is derived from those agroindustrial waste streams, but they're high performance and functionalized by these designer proteins in a dilute concentration. So that's sort of the basis of Werewool, where, nature gives us these infinite possibilities. And we look to nature for solutions directly for our materials. From here, so you can engineer microbes to make proteins that have certain function, but microbes actually on their own will make high value biopolymers from waste streams. So there's another class of bacteria. It's an acetic acid bacteria. It was actually originally identified in the 1950s by a scientist, Dr. Brown, who saw a film on top of vinegar fermentation. It turns out that this bacteria has been alive and well and being employed by humanity without knowing it since 2000 BC in Manchuria. It is a class of bacteria that takes sugars and nitrogen from rotting fruits and vegetables and converts it spins nanocellulose fibers. And those fibers self-assemble into a very strong, easily kind of very modular material. And so, however, like other biomaterials, so now these microorganisms cannot just give us, we can program them to do things, but they also can actually give us materials without the land use. So microbial nanocellulose, it can make in 22 days in a 5,000 meters of volume cubic meter bioreactor, can give us the amount of cellulose in very high purity with better mechanical properties than multiple hectares of eucalyptus over 7 years. So you have all these, and you're not using now you're not using that land use change. Like in the Anthropocene, back to that, humans have changed over 50% of the land use. So now you're making these things in the lab. You can feed these bacteria waste streams. Now, there's always a catch, right? Because these biomaterials like liquid. And so they're happy in a liquid environment and they change without liquid in natural state. That is not very good for a textile. You do not want, your clothing to swell or contract when the weather changes, right? You don't want it, there's a limit to that, right? So the challenge that for the industry, and this is where some of these materials are ready to go and some of them need work, is to regulate that hydration state and the corresponding mechanical properties so that it can be translated to textile applications. So that can be done, but you don't want to go back to those metals and the hazardous substances. You don't want to put a coating in it or a synthetic plasticizer, which is what that pressure is now for some of these emerging biomaterial companies, because to get it to market fast, which is a huge pressure, sometimes it has to compromise that kind of green parameter space integrity. So what we did for the microbial bioleather was really just an inspiration that we thought we would try, and it worked. What we did was we were like, this material is really leather-like, but it doesn't have a stable hydration state. And then going back to ancient textile techniques. So around the world, indigenous communities have been tanning leather, making hides that are very soft, water resistant, supple, through tanning and braining. So using the brain of the animal to tan it and then smoking it. And so we were really inspired by this. And my students and I started off by actually getting a brain from a butcher that was being discarded, and just as a curiosity and following these ancient techniques to see if it worked. Turns out the strength and flexibility of the material shot up by 3 times its original, and it had a degree of water resistance. Now that's not scalable, and we don't really I don't really want to be messing around with animal brains. But what we were able to do is say, what's in a brain? So what is in the brain that's changing the chemistry of this really low impact regenerative biomaterial? And we were to identify the phospholipids and the different compounds and make a plant-based version of it. So we developed this bio-based phosphorylation process that changes the cross-linking. It dramatically increases the strength, the ductility of the material. It makes it really stable. It is flame retardant up to a 3,000 degree Fahrenheit flame. It does not ignite. And this was achieved without any of the endocrine disrupting chemicals, without any of the waterproofing agents or plasticizers. And our biodegradation studies show that, cut up into small pieces, within 60 days, they lose, more than half of their mass in soil by microorganisms breaking them down. And if you have microorganisms break them back down, then the nutrients go back into the earth. So that was a really, that has set a really new, it is possible to stay in this green chemistry framework. It's possible to sort of follow, next to nature's blueprints and genius of evolving DNA sequences, the next most valuable information we have is traditional societies and traditional ecological intelligence that is rooted pre-industrial traditional science. And so our technology can draw on the frontiers by merging the frontiers of biotechnology with really traditional ecological intelligence rooted in environmental stewardship. We can really open up a whole space to make our processes and materials compatible with nature.
Going full circle back to the beginning of before we were industrialized.
Yeah, so taking the best of the human enterprise and learning from our mistakes.
I mean, you touched on this a little bit. You talked about scalability, and I wonder if you have any thoughts on how far away we are from this type of fashion tech being in a position to be scalable to transforming fashion's circular economy potential.
Both the work that I do, and that's really facilitated by partnering with transdisciplinary collaborations, are rooted in scalable technologies. They have to be. You can't develop new infrastructure. It's too expensive. There's not enough time. You have to kind of really think about, again, remember when you said thinking about the end at the beginning, you need to think about down the supply chain at the beginning. So Werewool, we were really honored to win the 2020 H&M Foundation Global Change Award, and that connected us with an incredible network throughout the supply chain that are willing to partner and really help us figure out our market value proposition and how we can always be keeping the scalability at cost in mind with existing infrastructure from the very beginning. And that actually has informed the way we engineer binding sites, et cetera, to be compatible with wet spinning processes. industrial fermentation is used for a lot of high value products. So that's in place. That's already there for, pharmaceuticals rely really heavily on industrial fermentation. And so it's rooted in that. Now, why isn't it on the market, right? Everyone is, there's currently these materials that offer color without dyes and stretch without plastics they don't exist. Bio leathers that are completely biodegradable and non-toxic and show the environmental impact, they're really not, you can't go out and buy it. There's some really exciting options. There's the Pinatex, there's the Milo, mushroom, mycelium leather that I'm really, really excited about. So what that's going to depend upon is actually this network. And that's where like some of the policy comes in and the accelerating and giving, brands and apparel brands have realized that they have really ambitious sustainability goals because they know they have to cut their carbon footprint by, 30, 50% in the next few years. So I think that both startups and brands are working together, and when these things reach the market is a little bit of a comparable trajectory. It's analogous to when do we go down to lower our carbon emissions to stay within 1.5 degrees. It depends. So business as usual, no, they're not going to get there in time because we don't have the right support network and the infrastructure. It's growing. But now as these relationships grow, and this comes back to these are system level changes where we need, global conferences, but they're also individual changes. So at the individual level, creating partnerships. And this podcast was such an exciting opportunity because I think whenever I get a chance to share, like these things are there, they're available, but we need partnerships to get them to market. It really kind of, it takes away, I think, some of the, how do we act to reach these goals? And I think we've talked about a lot of ways that we can act to reach these goals. So I think that by combining waste to resource, for instance, combining waste to resource processes like extracting biopolymers from waste streams, that can be value added for both, agricultural industry and the fashion industry and lower impacts across the most polluting industries. But when are we going to make those relationships that we have new supply chains rooted in circularity? And I wish I had a good answer. I think it'd be fascinating to have a compelling map of here's what we need to do to get these to market the way we have. Here's what we need to do to get carbon emissions below 1.5. But hopefully this starts the conversation or continues the conversation. Materials innovation, material impact. There's a lot of organizations that are really trying to help accelerate startups for lab to market tech transfer. So I'm excited to see what happens. I remain hopeful, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's very clear from this whole conversation that technology has a really exciting potential to transform the fashion industry. We have talked about policy change and behavioral change. We've got to get past this idea that we wear things once and we discard them. And I think that part of that is, you've highlighted it so well, it's raising awareness. It's understanding where it comes from and where it goes, and that that's not sustainable. And the technology you've talked about does give us hope that we can at least intervene in a part of that equation. So if you were to summarize, technology obviously is going to play a big role in reshaping the future of fashion. If you had to pick just the top 3 that you think have the greatest potential to have the biggest impact, what do you think they'd be?
So I think it will be rooted in a combination of biofabrication materials combined with waste to resource strategies, and then also combined. So it's not sort of like it's mycelium, it's pineapple leather. I don't have that kind of answer because I think that would miss a lot of it. But I think that there are, the scientist will look at this and say there are enormous opportunities, nano, micro, macro supply chain level. And the biggest opportunity is the thing that's going to change things is putting those together. So microbial fermentation for high value building blocks combined with non-toxic chemistry to waste streams, combined with strategy. So for the bioleather sneakers, for instance, we either grew the materials to the shape of the pattern or cast them to the shape of the pattern. And that allows you to cut so much waste out. So if you think about, this in the supply chain, it's something like 40 to 60% of materials are lost before, like, to the factory, at every stage of production. So if you can think about, and at FIT, the students, when they cut patterns, 30% is gone. Right there, patterning to shape, 3D printing, digital design, biofabrication to shape, allows you to reduce impacts by 30 to 50% because you're not wasting that material. And so I'm then scaling up. So there's the biomanufacturing at scale, and then partnerships. So I think going from really nano, micro, macro, but identifying a parameter space for green processing will be really, really a big part where this will find it, because all those solutions can be, is the biopolymer from pineapples? Is it from mushroom, fungal mycelium? That part's okay. We need, there's going to be different resources in different places, and we need a lot of bits of Legos, right? We need a modular system. But if we work within this framework, I think all those really exciting options, spider silk, mycelium leather, pineapple leather, apple leather from waste streams, that cotton grown in a lab, galleys growing cotton in a lab. So all these kind of options can displace traditional materials and lower the impacts. And the biggest impact will be putting them together, creating an infrastructure that links these innovations together.
So that's the game changer, how we link all of these things to help them amplify one another.
The solutions are there, really simple, straightforward solutions or more advanced solutions, and it's executing them. So I'm hopeful to see. I don't expect the climate conference next week to be talking about biofabrication of textiles, but I'm hoping it really makes these links that need to happen, where the feedback loops go in the right direction. So we're at, again, this is it. We're at this tipping point. The next 10 years is going to determine the next 10,000. What can we make? We're in the midst of a web of feedback loops. Let's put them in the right direction and stay hopeful that we'll learn from that.
When you say the next 10 years is going to determine the next 10,000, I get goosebumps, literally goosebumps. It is just quite remarkable. When you put it like that, you make the word tipping point mean something completely different. So you've been incredibly generous, talking about in so much detail about some really fascinating things that until I looked up what you were doing, I hadn't seen. And I have to say that watching the YouTube clip of how you did the sneakers was just incredible. So it was really fascinating. I've asked a lot of questions. Do you have a final thought, something I haven't asked and you are really keen to share with listeners? Is there one final word, one takeaway, one call to action, anything you want to add?
I'd like to encourage everyone to find, to keep pursuing some of these ideas we've discussed and see where is the most accessible thing to make a difference. Is it contacting your congressperson? Is it reducing your personal waste? Is it all of the above? Is it in your enterprise, young people that are going into biotech? If you have any questions, reach out, but I hope that people sort of see that there's so many opportunities accessible, and some will make more sense for different communities and different areas, and that it doesn't seem so daunting. So I hope some of these conversations don't seem daunting. I'm hopeful to see what comes out of the conference next week. And I think the thought I'd like to leave is that, this tipping point maybe sounds scary, but if human activity in the last 50 years got us to this point, well, then we know human activity can get us away from this point, and we know what we need to do. So I think it's just, it's just paying attention. It's a little bit ironic now because I've chatted so much this hour, but sort of listening more than you talk. It's probably an important time.
If we didn't know before this conversation with you what we need to do, we do now. So thank you for that. Thank you so much, Theanne.
Thanks, Antoinette. It's been a pleasure to chat with you.
Thank you for tuning into our very first series. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe. And since we're a new show, please circulate our information with your friends, family, and colleagues. Extra points if you subscribe and throw us a rating.